in the sleepy village of Dalamere, where the loudest sound was often the clink of teacups and the rustle of the morning paper, something deeply unsettling had arrived with the fog. On a Wednesday morning draped in mist, Mrs. Edith Holloway burst into Miss Marla Kent's parlor, face pale and eyes wild, clutching a gossip too impossible to ignore. "He's back, Marla. Thomas Reed. I saw him at the Grey Fern Inn alive and well." Marla froze. The name struck her like a chill wind through an open window. Thomas Reed, the reclusive historian, had died the week before. She remembered clearly reading the obituary in the Daily Herald, and even seeing the funeral notice posted near the chapel. Yet now, here he was, apparently alive, sipping brandy in the very inn where her own grandfather once vanished without a trace. That evening, her curiosity turned to unease, as she found the article again. Same man, same face, same date of death. A clerical error. Impossible. The paper never got such things wrong. And if it wasn't a mistake, then who, or what, was now residing in room 7? The next day, Marla strolled past the Grey Fern, heart pounding, and through the window she saw him. Same piercing eyes, same posture, but his movements were strangely rehearsed, mechanical almost, as if mimicking life rather than living it. He stared at the door constantly, not with expectation, but with dread, as if waiting for something, someone, to find him. That evening, under the excuse of returning a borrowed candlestick, she stepped inside, and casually questioned Mr. Havers, the innkeeper. And just as she mentioned the guest's name, he appeared, Thomas Reed, or at least the man who looked like him. He smiled politely, but there was something hollow in his eyes. A flicker, a twitch, as if the soul behind them wasn't his own. In that moment, Marla Kent didn't know if she was standing in front of a man back from the dead, or something pretending to be human. The quiet village of Dunbridge Hollow had always carried the gentle hum of a place lost in time, where whispers died behind lace curtains and scandal rarely crossed the hedgerows. But on one damp October morning, something shattered that rhythm like a dropped teacup. Agnes Crowthorne, the innkeeper's no-nonsense sister, burst into Miss Elspeth Hartley's cottage, eyes wide, hands shaking, not from fear, but disbelief. Elspeth, William Hargrove just checked into the Hollow Haven Inn. The name sent a sharp chill through Elspeth's spine, not because it was unfamiliar, but because the man had been declared dead. A full-page obituary, a funeral, and even a eulogy delivered by the mayor himself had cemented William's demise just 8 days prior. Elspeth, a former wartime codebreaker with a mind like a scalpel, rose from her chair with a deliberateness that suggested far more than curiosity. By evening, she was strolling past the ivy-covered inn, her gaze catching the silhouette of a man seated rigidly in the lounge, head low, fingers twitching, as if haunted by the very walls that held him. The next day, after exchanging pleasantries with the innkeeper, she was introduced to the man himself. His handshake was lukewarm, his smile calculated, and his eyes that darted nervously, as if every second might bring someone, or something through that door. Elspeth noted everything, his voice too rehearsed, his pauses too unnatural, and his reaction when she said the name of his late wife. Shock, like a blade had grazed him. That night, over the crackling of her fire, she unfolded the newspaper clippings again, lips tightening. It wasn't just the wrong man living under a dead man's name. No, it was something else, something older, darker. As whispers began to spread, about a phone call in the post office, a stranger trembling in the confessional, and a shadowy figure seen digging near the churchyard, Elspeth knew only one thing for certain. The man who came back wasn't William Hargrove, and whoever he was, he had no intention of leaving alive. It was on the 4th evening of heavy rain that Eleanor Vane noticed something odd about the man renting the old caretaker's lodge. He came and went without pattern, always at dusk, always in the same worn trench coat with the collar turned up, not against the cold, but as if to hide his face. Mrs. Linton, who ran the post office, swore she saw him tear up a telegram outside, then burn the pieces right there in the public bin. Eleanor, ever curious, had watched from her upstairs window, as he stood for nearly an hour in the garden, unmoving, staring at nothing, or so it seemed. But last night, there was movement. A second figure, half hidden behind the withered hedges, watching the lodge with the patience of a hunter. That morning, a child had found a silver cigarette case at the foot of the well, etched with the initials E.F., a name that did not appear in the village records, but which rang faint bells in the minds of the elders, tied to a scandal that had supposedly died with the war. Eleanor lit the last of her candles, and made a decision. This was no coincidence. Someone had returned to Greybridge not to be seen, but to find something, or someone. And if Eleanor was right, the truth wouldn't stay buried much longer. The wind carried a sharp chill, as Miss Edith Langley stepped through the weather-worn gates of Ashcombe Parish, her boots crunching over the frost-laced gravel. She hadn't intended to return so soon, but unanswered questions had a way of pulling her back. Inside the dim chapel, she found Reverend Halbrook meticulously polishing a brass cross, his expression thoughtful beneath the pale light of a stained glass window. "Reverend," she began, her tone gentle yet probing, "I wonder if I might trouble you regarding a recent service, the burial of one Mr. Elijah Crane." A subtle tension passed through the Reverend's shoulders before he set the cross down. Yes," he said slowly. "A rather abrupt affair. Little fanfare. Fewer mourners. Almost as if the world barely noticed his passing." Edith nodded, her gaze fixed on the pews, silent shadows stretching across the floor. "And the body?" she asked. A pause. Then with reluctant honesty, the Reverend replied, "The casket remained closed throughout. I was told the state of the remains made it necessary." "Told by whom?" she pressed. "Dr. Godfrey, I believe. Everything was arranged before I arrived. Quite efficient, really. Perhaps too efficient." Edith lingered in that moment of silence, catching the flicker of doubt behind his glasses. No family had come forward. No close friends had spoken. Just a name in print, a date on a headstone, and a sealed wooden box lowered into the earth. As she stepped outside, the cold air biting at her cheeks, a single thought burned in her mind. If no one had seen Elijah Crane's face in that coffin, had there ever been a body at all? That evening, seated beside the amber glow of her fire, Edith pieced together the disquieting facts. A man pronounced dead, his funeral carried out in haste, and a casket no one opened. And yet, just days later, a man bearing Crane's likeness had been seen boarding a train in Dover, alone, cloaked, and nervously glancing over his shoulder. A trick of resemblance, perhaps, or something far more deliberate. If Elijah Crane had staged his death, he had done so with remarkable precision. But why? He was neither a wanted man, nor a recluse. He had wealth, status, and no known enemies, at least. None on record. Edith's brow furrowed. Perhaps the most dangerous secrets are the ones never written down. Was he hiding from someone? Escaping justice? Or protecting someone else? She considered a darker possibility. What if the man now walking free wasn't Crane at all? What if someone had assumed his identity to access something? Or someone he had left behind? Either way, a single truth remained undeniable. A death notice did not guarantee a death. And in Ashcombe, beneath the fog and the silence, something carefully buried was beginning to stir. The question echoed in Miss Eleanor Bryce's mind like a whisper that refused to fade. Why would a man stage his own death, only to emerge days later in a forgotten village, under a false name? The thought gnawed at her, sharp and persistent. Grey Hollow was a place where nothing ever happened, or so its residents liked to believe. But Eleanor had lived long enough to know that still waters often hid the darkest secrets. The man who called himself Edward Mallory had arrived quietly, paid in cash, and kept mostly to himself. Polite, reserved, and always alert, too alert. His clothes were tailored, but slightly out of date. his accent refined yet inconsistent. And there was something about the way he scanned the room each time he entered the inn's dining area, as though expecting someone to rise and shout, "I know who you are." Eleanor, once a librarian, and now the village's unofficial keeper of secrets, had noticed it all. And it didn't add up. She'd already heard whispers about the real Edward Mallory's untimely death. An accident, they'd said, followed by a quiet funeral, and a closed casket. No one had seen the body. No one had asked questions. Until now. She dug through public records, newspaper obituaries, and property transfers, uncovering a land deed signed just days after the funeral, by someone using the deceased man's name. That morning, the fog hung low like a curtain drawn over the truth, and something in the air felt wrong. When Mr. Carter, the innkeeper, knocked at Edward's door and received no answer, he tried again, louder, concern prickling at his spine. Still nothing. Eleanor was already on the landing by the time he unlocked the door. The room was empty, bed untouched, wardrobe stripped bare. There was no note, no sign of struggle, no payment left behind. Only a single gold cufflink sat atop the dresser, polished and placed deliberately, almost ceremonially. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't a guest quietly slipping away in the night. This was a message, a warning, a clue. Someone was watching. Someone who knew that Eleanor had been asking too many questions. And as she stood there, heart pounding beneath her cardigan, she realized with grim clarity, this was no longer about uncovering the truth. It was about surviving it. The game had shifted, and it was far from over. The door creaked open with a reluctant groan, as though the room itself was hesitating to reveal what it held. Mrs. Whitmore, the landlady of the Briarwood Inn for over 20 years, had seen her fair share of odd guests. But this was different. The air inside was heavy, disturbed, not with the usual staleness of an empty room, but with a presence that had just fled. Her footsteps softened on the rug as her eyes scanned the space, each corner speaking of haste and something left unfinished. The bed was still unmade, sheets twisted like they had been tossed off mid-dream, or mid-struggle. The wardrobe stood wide open, its hangers swinging lightly, rhythmically, as if recently brushed by a hurried hand. Every drawer in the chest had been pulled out, some still half-hanging, contents missing. On the dresser, the dust had been smeared by fingers dragging across it, someone searching for something. But what unsettled her most was the writing desk by the window. A leather-bound journal lay sprawled open, not gently placed but thrown, its pages crumpled where they bent against the edge. The last entry was only half a sentence, the ink trailing off as if the writer had been interrupted mid-thought, perhaps mid-realization. The pen beside it had leaked, a small puddle of ink staining the desk like a wound, black and gleaming. A porcelain teacup stood nearby, untouched except for the faint curl of steam still rising from within, an eerie sign of how recent the departure had been. Then she noticed it. A smear, just beside the cup, almost hidden beneath the base. Not ink. Thicker, darker. She leaned in. Blood. Dried but recent. Her pulse quickened. Whoever had been here hadn't just left. They'd been taken or forced out, possibly injured. A soft sound came from behind, and she turned to see Eleanor march at the doorway. The school teacher's quiet presence didn't need an invitation. She stepped into the room, her expression unreadable, eyes sharp with the kind of clarity reserved for those who'd seen too much and spoken too little. She moved with purpose, scanning the room not as a visitor, but as an investigator, her gaze soaking in every disruption. And then she stopped. Her fingers plucked something from the curtain's hem, a scrap of torn paper, its edges ragged, as if ripped in haste. Scrawled across it in a hurried slanted hand were 3 chilling words. "They found me." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes lifted to the open window, where the iron latch had been snapped clean off. The breeze whistled through the broken frame, and on the windowsill lay a single glove, brown leather, lined with wool, the kind a man would wear in the cold mornings. Its fingertips were rigid, its palm stained deep with that same dark substance. Blood, not spilled, but pressed, smeared, as if the hand inside had been gripping something in fear or pain. Eleanor picked it up slowly, the weight of it more psychological than physical. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was still blurred. This was no hasty departure, no guest slipping out to avoid a bill or vanish into anonymity. This was something orchestrated, precise, quiet, and terrifying. She turned to Mrs. Whitmore, voice barely above a whisper. "This wasn't an exit," she said. "It was an extraction. Someone had come for the missing man, and they hadn't come through the front door." The room was silent again, but the silence now screamed with secrets. Miss Marple carefully placed the glove back where she had found it, her fingers lingering for a moment as her thoughts raced. The small item, so innocuous at first glance, now felt like the key to a much larger puzzle, a puzzle she was determined to solve. The stain on the glove, ink or blood, wasn't just a trivial mark. It was a signal, a sign that the events unfolding in this quiet village were far from ordinary. She stood motionless for a moment, her mind piecing together the fragments of evidence that had started to form a terrifying picture. The ink had to mean something. The question was, what? It was more than a mere clue. It was the bridge between what she saw and what she needed to understand. She could feel the pieces of the story drawing closer, and she wouldn't stop until the truth was hers to unravel. Standing beside Mr. Carter at the front desk, Miss Marple kept her attention fixed on the guest register. He flipped through the pages, his movements calm, habitual. He had done this 1,000 times before, but to her, each page was a new riddle, each name a potential answer. Travelers, businessmen, a few names scribbled hastily, nothing of interest. But when the ink of Gerald Finch's name came into view, something caught her eye. The signature was strange. At first it looked like the same bold, confident hand she'd seen just days before. But the more she stared at it, the more she realized the subtle shift. The strokes were uneven, trembling. The letters no longer flowed smoothly, as they once had. It was as if the man who had arrived with such purpose had left with uncertainty. The signature had been altered, a reflection of the hurried state in which it was made. Or worse, the result of something more sinister. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she turned toward Mr. Carter. "You see it too, don't you?" Her voice was soft, but the weight of the question hung in the air. He didn't answer immediately, but the look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. He knew it was strange. They both knew. "It's a forgery," she muttered under her breath. Or, her thoughts trailed off, but she didn't need to finish the sentence. The other possibility seemed far worse. Gerald Finch had been forced under duress to sign in a state of fear, with no choice but to comply. Mr. Carter nodded slowly, a shadow crossing his face. It was a thought neither of them was eager to voice, but it was the only one that made sense, and it was not a comforting one. Something was terribly wrong. And before Miss Marple could investigate further, the door swung open, and the village constable stepped in, his face pale, eyes wide with concern. "I thought you'd like to know, Miss Marple," he said, his voice thick with unease. "Finch's residence in London. It's been completely emptied. There's nothing left, no furniture, no records. It's as if he never lived there at all." Miss Marple's hands folded in her lap, her mind working through the implications. A man had vanished overnight. His life had been erased so thoroughly, so meticulously, that not a trace remained, not even a scrap of paper to prove he had existed. It was almost as if someone had scrubbed him from history itself. She turned toward the constable, her expression unreadable. "Whoever did this wasn't just trying to cover their tracks," she said, her voice calm but edged with a quiet fury. "This isn't the work of a man trying to disappear. This is deliberate. This is a complete erasure, a methodical wiping away of a life. Whoever is behind this isn't just hiding Finch. They're eliminating any proof he ever existed. Her mind raced through the possibilities, trying to connect the dots. Was Finch truly gone? Or was he hiding in plain sight, carefully constructed behind layers of lies? The more she uncovered, the more it seemed as if someone was going to extraordinary lengths to keep the truth hidden. Whatever had happened, whoever had orchestrated this was no ordinary disappearance. This was a calculated, cold and relentless effort to bury something or someone. The man who had walked into the inn just days ago was now a phantom, his very identity under question. And Miss Marple knew one thing with absolute certainty. The truth was buried deep, and she would find it, no matter the cost. The village churchyard, bathed in the pale, mournful light of early morning, had always been a place of reflection. The gravestones, worn and weathered by time, told silent stories, names long faded, marking lives that had passed into history. It was a place of quiet reverence, yet it was here, amidst the peaceful solitude, that Miss Marple first noticed the woman. Standing alone, her form cloaked in mourning black, she seemed an integral part of the scene, as if she had always been there, her sorrow woven into the very fabric of the churchyard. Her posture was rigid, betraying the weight of her grief, and her gloved fingers clutched a small tarnished locket, as though it was the last thing holding her together. Her gaze lingered on one particular gravestone, not fresh, but not yet claimed by the earth's passage of time. It was a headstone that stood out, as if it had a story of its own to tell. Miss Marple, attuned to the subtleties of human nature, did not approach immediately. Instead, she studied the woman from a distance, noting the sincerity in her mourning. This was no casual visitor, no distant relative paying a brief obligatory tribute. The grief was palpable in the woman's every movement, the slight tremble in her hands, the way her fingers gently traced the edges of the locket, as though drawing comfort from it, and the quiet sadness that radiated from her, filling the air with a sense of lost time. Miss Marple could feel the weight of her sorrow from where she stood. She had learned long ago that people rarely lingered in such places without reason. Given the strange events surrounding Gerald Finch's disappearance, she couldn't help but feel that this woman's presence here was far from coincidental. Miss Marple moved closer, her steps slow and measured, until she was standing just a few feet away. She spoke softly, her voice imbued with the warmth of quiet understanding. "A loss can weigh heavily on the heart," she said, her tone gentle, allowing the woman to know she was not intruding, merely acknowledging a shared human experience. The woman started slightly, as if shaken from deep thoughts, and turned to face Miss Marple. Her eyes were red-rimmed, the mark of recent tears, yet they held a sharpness that suggested an inner strength, perhaps even a hidden edge. For a moment, there was hesitation in her gaze, as if she was trying to decide whether to trust the stranger standing before her. Finally, she spoke, her voice thick with sorrow, yet tinged with an air of finality. "Yes," she murmured, "it can." Miss Marple, ever perceptive, allowed the silence to stretch, not pushing, but patiently waiting. She knew that silence, in moments like these, had a power of its own, one that invited confidences more freely than any direct question ever could. The woman stood there, as though the grief she carried was too heavy for words, but eventually, a faint tremor passed through her, and she exhaled a shuddering breath. "My name is Agatha Finch," she said, her voice trembling slightly with the weight of the name. "Gerald Finch was my brother." Miss Marple, ever the keen observer, inclined her head, acknowledging the revelation with a subtle nod. She didn't rush to respond, choosing instead to let the moment hang in the air, her mind processing the name. Gerald Finch, the very man whose disappearance had been gnawing at the edges of her investigation. Agatha Finch's presence here, in the quiet graveyard, was no accident. Miss Marple could sense it. "I understand," Miss Marple replied, her tone neutral but soft, careful not to reveal too much. "I hadn't seen him in years," Agatha continued, her voice laden with regret. "We had our differences, things left unsaid, unresolved." Her words trailed off, and for a moment, it was as if she was speaking not just to Miss Marple, but the memory of her brother, standing between them in the churchyard. The unfinished conversation hung in the air like an unsolved mystery, and Miss Marple could feel it pulling her deeper into the web of this family's secrets. What had Elena Finch known about her brother that had driven them apart? And why, after all this time, was she standing here now, mourning a man whose very existence seemed to have been erased from the world? Miss Marple's curiosity piqued, but she remained silent, waiting for Elena to continue, to reveal what she could, and what, perhaps, she was too afraid to say. Elena's words hung in the air, heavy with unresolved grief. "But I was there when he was buried," she said, her voice faltering slightly. "I saw the coffin lowered into the ground." Miss Marple said nothing at first, allowing the statement to settle, though a sense of discomfort tugged at her, given the strange circumstances surrounding Gerald Finch's disappearance. Yet, she didn't correct the woman, for something in Elena's voice spoke of an inner turmoil, a desire to hold on to a truth she was no longer certain of. Instead, Miss Marple chose her next words carefully, as if testing the fragile thread of trust between them. "Forgive me," she said gently, her voice soft, yet laden with unspoken understanding. "But did you see him, my dear, before the service?" Elena hesitated, her eyes darting away, her gaze momentarily lost in the past. "No," she admitted finally, her voice distant. "The casket was closed. The doctors said it was best that way. He had been—" Her words faltered, a polite phrase caught on the tip of her tongue, but Miss Marple knew it was a much darker reality that Elena was avoiding. A deliberate illness, perhaps. The question lingered between them, unspoken. "You were certain it was him, then?" Miss Marple pressed, her tone calm yet persistent, watching Elena's reaction closely. Elena's response was swift, perhaps too quick. "Of course," she said, her voice defensive, almost as if she were trying to convince herself more than Miss Marple. But there was something in her tone, something that made Miss Marple pause. A woman reaffirming her belief rather than her certainty. The detective knew this could not be ignored. Elena Finch standing here seemed like someone clinging to a version of the truth she so desperately wanted to believe. Miss Marple watched her closely, her mind turning over the small clues that had already been left in her wake. "You must have loved him very much," Miss Marple said softly, her words carrying a weight of quiet sympathy. Elena's face shifted then, her expression wavering like a fragile image on water. For a moment, it was as if the woman had been struck by the magnitude of her own loss. "I wish I had known him better," she whispered, the sorrow in her voice palpable. It was a confession, a longing for a connection that perhaps had never truly existed. In that moment, Miss Marple understood more than she had anticipated. Elena Finch, believing she had buried her brother, was now standing before her, a woman caught between memory and truth, unable to reconcile the contradiction that had slowly begun to unravel. There was no denying it now. Something more was at play here than anyone had dared to consider. The woman's grip tightened around her locket, her fingers almost white with the force of her hold, as if the object itself might offer her some measure of solace. Her voice dropped to a near whisper, as though even now, in the safety of the churchyard, she feared being overheard. "Gerald was never a man given to dramatics," Elena began, her words slow and deliberate. "He was sensible, predictable, careful." Miss Marple's eyes never left her, her expression serene, but her mind raced. What was Elena leading her towards? What was the truth she was still trying to avoid? "And yet," Elena continued, her voice faltering slightly, "a few months before his death, something changed. He became anxious, withdrawn. He told me just once that he was being followed." Miss Marple's fingers tightened subtly around the handle of her handbag, her pulse quickening with the new revelation. "Followed," she repeated, the words slipping from her lips sharp with intrigue. "Yes," Elena said, her voice trembling now. "He wouldn't say by whom, but he was certain of it. He thought someone was watching him, waiting." The air between them seemed to thicken, the weight of the unspoken truth pressing down on both women. Miss Marple nodded, urging Elena to continue without saying a word. She knew the silence was her ally now, allowing the woman to speak without pressure. Elena took a shaky breath, her eyes clouding over as she relived the memories. "He told me he knew something he wished he didn't, and that if anything happened to him," her voice faltered again, her words hanging in the air like a silent warning. "Well, he never finished that sentence," she whispered, her eyes welling up with tears that she had clearly fought to hold back. Miss Marple felt the sting of those unspoken words. The haunting implications were clear. Gerald Finch had known something dangerous, something that had led him to fear for his life. And now, with him gone, Miss Marple couldn't help but wonder if those cryptic words were the key to unlocking the terrible mystery that surrounded him. The chilling truth was beginning to take shape, and with it, the realization that Elena Finch's grief, her certainty, was nothing more than a veil over a far darker reality. Something had happened to Gerald Finch, something he had been terrified to reveal. And whatever it was still very much alive. A quiet chill settled between them, as if the very air had grown heavy with unspoken truths. Miss Marple's voice broke the silence, soft yet probing. "You believed him?" Her question hung in the air, delicate yet insistent. Elena hesitated, the weight of her own uncertainty pressing down on her. "At the time," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I thought he was imagining things. But now," she exhaled sharply, the admission a slow burn of realization. "Now, I wonder." Miss Marple, ever calm, tapped a thoughtful finger against the handle of her handbag, her mind already tracing the lines of the puzzle. "If Gerald Finch truly feared for his life," she said, "then two questions remain. Was his fear justified? And if so, did someone ensure that fear became a reality?" Elena's throat tightened, her gaze locking onto the gravestones before them, her mind fighting to reconcile the image of her brother with the eerie truth she was beginning to accept. "I thought I buried my brother, Miss Marple," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But now, I don't know what to think." Her hands trembled slightly as she clasped them together, as though trying to hold herself together, to keep the growing terror at bay. Later that evening, as the fire crackled in her study, Miss Marple sat deep in thought, her mind sifting through the tangled web of this strange case. A man declared dead, yet never seen in death. A guest at the inn who bore his name, only to vanish into thin air, his absence almost too perfect, too deliberate. And the sister, Eleanor, who had dismissed her brother's fears, only to be left with questions that could no longer be ignored. But it wasn't just those missing pieces that disturbed her. It was the deeper question that still gnawed at her. What had Gerald Finch known that had made him a target? Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she leaned forward, the flames from the hearth casting flickering shadows on her thoughtful face. She had solved many mysteries in her time, but this one was different. It was unlike anything she had encountered before. This wasn't a crime of passion, nor was it driven by greed, at least not in any ordinary sense. No, this was something far more intricate, something deeply hidden, a secret perhaps that someone had gone to great lengths to bury. But secrets, Miss Marple knew, had a nasty habit of resurfacing, no matter how carefully they were concealed. Her lips curved into a small knowing smile, a flicker of quiet determination in her eyes. She would unravel this. She had to, because in the end, the truth was always there, waiting. All one needed to do was know where to look. The next morning, Eleanor returned to Miss Marple's study with a photograph in hand. She placed it on the table between them. The edges of the photo curled slightly with age, the image frozen in time. Eleanor smoothed her fingers over its worn surface, her gaze distant as memories stirred. "This was taken years ago," she murmured, her voice soft with nostalgia. "Gerald never liked having his picture taken. But this one was different." She paused, her finger lingering on the edge of the photo, as if it held the answer to everything. He looked, her voice faltered, and for a moment, Miss Marple saw a flicker of something deeper in Elena's eyes. A mix of longing and regret, the weight of a past she couldn't change. "Stronger," Eleanor continued, her voice shaking slightly, more certain of himself. Miss Marple leaned forward, her gaze unwavering as she studied the photograph. It was a simple thing, just a snapshot of a man long since gone. But there was something about it, something in the way Elena spoke, that made Miss Marple wonder if this picture held more than just a memory. It could very well be a clue. Gerald Finch had been many things, but one thing was certain. Something had shifted in him before his death. And now it seemed, the more they uncovered, the more his story became entangled with secrets that could no longer be ignored. Miss Marple peered at the photograph, with quiet concentration, her sharp eyes tracing every line, every shadow in the faded sepia tones. The man in the picture, he was indeed familiar, unmistakable even. The high forehead, the sharp cheekbones, the strong jawline, they were all unmistakably Gerald Finch. But there was something different, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The man in the photograph wore a neatly trimmed mustache, a subtle detail that added an air of confidence he hadn't possessed in life. His posture was self-assured, his gaze steady, unwavering, almost challenging. It was a far cry from the nervous, fidgeting man she had glimpsed at the White Hart Inn. "You see it, don't you?" Eleanor's voice broke the silence, almost desperate for confirmation. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her fingers resting lightly on the edges of the photograph. "Yes, my dear," she said, her voice soft yet firm. "The resemblance is certainly there, but not a perfect one." She paused, her eyes narrowing, as she studied the image more closely, the gears in her mind slowly clicking into place. "Confidence is not something one loses so easily," she continued, tapping a delicate finger against the photograph's surface. And yet the man at the inn was always looking over his shoulder, as if he were expecting something, or someone. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. "Then who was staying at the inn?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Instead, her thoughts were already spinning, weaving a new and troubling possibility in the dark recesses of her mind. She could feel it, a new direction, a new thread that might lead them somewhere unexpected. Eleanor's trembling hands broke through her thoughts, as she carefully set a heavy ledger down on the table. The leather cover, worn smooth with age, looked as though it had held countless secrets. "Gerald kept records of everything," Eleanor explained, her voice tinged with a mixture of sadness and reverence. "Case notes, personal dealings, even old receipts. He was meticulous." Miss Marple took the ledger carefully, flipping through the pages. The neat handwriting was precisely what one would expect from a man like Gerald Finch, methodical, organized as though every detail mattered. But then her eyes landed on something that stood out. A scribbled note in the margin, hastily written but unmistakably in Gerald's familiar hand. "Here," Eleanor whispered, her finger trembling, as it pointed to the note. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than a casual, inconspicuous comment. But as Miss Marple leaned in, her breath caught in her throat. The words were chillingly clear. "If anything happens, find Elena. The answer lies in the will." The silence between them was thick, suffocating, as the weight of the words settled over them, like a heavy shroud. Eleanor's voice, barely audible, broke the quiet. "He knew," she whispered. "He knew something was going to happen to him." Miss Marple closed the ledger gently, her fingers lingering on the worn leather cover. Her expression was grave, her mind already racing ahead, connecting the dots. "A will," she murmured softly. "That would suggest a motive, would it not?" Eleanor swallowed hard, her hands tightening on the edge of the table, as she looked at Miss Marple, a mix of confusion and fear in her eyes. "But what could be in it that was worth killing over?" she asked, her voice trembling, as she tried to process the impossible notion. Miss Marple glanced back at the hastily scribbled note, the unsettling feeling deepening in her chest. "That is precisely what we must find out," she replied, her voice cold and determined. The danger, the intrigue, the shadows, they were all closing in, and the more they uncovered, the more Miss Marple realized the true scope of what they were dealing with. A simple will, she suspected, could be the key to a much larger conspiracy. But there were forces at play here, forces that would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. "My dear," Miss Marple said quietly, her voice calm yet filled with a quiet determination, "this is what we must now find out." The offices of Lester and Company were precisely as Miss Marple had anticipated, modest, orderly, and entirely devoid of anything superfluous. It was a workspace designed to exude nothing but efficiency and trust, a place meant to inspire confidence in anyone who stepped through the door. The solicitor, Mr. Lester, was a thin, well-groomed man in his 60s, with the practiced air of someone who had seen and heard much over the years. He greeted them with polite efficiency, but Miss Marple couldn't help but notice the brief flicker of surprise in his eyes when he recognized Elena Finch. "Miss Finch," he said smoothly, gesturing toward the chairs in front of his desk. "I must say, I wasn't expecting you. How may I assist?" "A small matter," Miss Marple interjected lightly, her tone casual, though there was an edge to her words. "Miss Finch has been sorting through some of her brother's belongings and found a rather intriguing photograph. We thought you might recall when it was taken." Her voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable underlying tension. Elena slid the photograph across the desk toward him, her movements deliberate. Mr. Lester reached for it, but the moment his eyes fell upon the image, his fingers twitched. It was a slight movement, almost imperceptible, but Miss Marple noticed it immediately. The carefully composed solicitor had stiffened for the briefest of moments, and then, just as quickly, he regained his composure, the mask of professionalism slipping back into place. He set the photograph aside with deliberate nonchalance, adjusting the papers on his desk as if the photograph were of no consequence. "Ah yes," he said, his voice steady but carrying a note of hesitation. "Gerald Finch. This must have been taken some years ago." His words, though polite, rang hollow, like a man trying too hard to seem unaffected. Miss Marple watched his hands closely. They were steady, but as he reached for his pen, she noticed a subtle flicker, a tiny, almost imperceptible hesitation. It was a small thing, but to someone like Miss Marple, it was telling. "Curious," she murmured, her voice soft but pointed. "Oh, Mr. Lester." The solicitor seemed to stiffen slightly, his gaze flicking up from the desk to meet hers. "Yes," he prompted, though his tone carried the practiced air of a man who had already decided how little he would reveal. "It's just that the resemblance is striking," Miss Marple continued, her words deliberate and probing, "especially to a certain guest at the White Hart Inn." Her eyes never left Mr. Lester's face as she spoke, watching for any reaction, any crack in the otherwise calm exterior. This time there was no sharp intake of breath, no immediate startled expression. Mr. Lester's face remained neutral, but Miss Marple could feel the tension building in the air. The silence stretched for a moment, just long enough for her to notice the faintest trace of unease flicker in his eyes. It was subtle, but to someone with Miss Marple's sharp intuition, it was everything. A momentary lapse in control. In that brief silence, Miss Marple could sense the web of secrets tightening around them. She knew something was wrong, something Mr. Lester was not saying, and she was getting closer to the truth. But she also understood that this was just the beginning. The solicitor's carefully crafted mask might hold for a time, but Miss Marple knew that no secret could remain hidden forever, especially when she was determined to uncover it. "Enough, Mr. Lester said, his voice strained as he cleared his throat, carefully setting the photograph aside with exaggerated precision. "An old resemblance, nothing more," he added smoothly, the words flowing effortlessly from his lips, though Miss Marple noticed the faint tremor in his hand as it hovered over the photograph. "I wouldn't read too much into it." Miss Marple's lips curled into a smile that was deceptively warm, yet had the unsettling effect of making even the most self-assured men uneasy. "Of course," she replied, her voice light and pleasant, almost as though nothing had transpired. But inside she was certain. The photograph had clearly unsettled him, and that was undeniable. What was more telling, however, was the fact that he had not outright denied its implications. He had merely brushed them aside, as if to dismiss their significance altogether. The unspoken truth was far too close for comfort. Her mind raced. Gerald Finch's fears, the cryptic message hidden in his ledger, the unexpected behavior of the solicitor. Everything pointed to the same chilling conclusion. The will. As they stepped outside into the cool air, Miss Marple turned to Elena, her voice low but filled with resolve. "I do believe, Elena," she said thoughtfully, "that it is time we discovered exactly what your brother left behind." The weight of her words hung in the air, the next step of the mystery now painfully clear. The pieces were falling into place, and Miss Marple knew that they were on the verge of something far more dangerous than they had yet imagined. Chapter 7. A deception unraveled. Miss Marple had always believed that mysteries were like knitting. Each stitch was connected, forming a pattern that only revealed itself when one took a step back. And now at last, the pattern had come into view. The man at the White Hart Inn was not Gerald Finch. That much was undeniable. The photograph had confirmed it. And so too had the subtle clues. The nervous behavior, the altered signature, the ink-stained glove. Each of these was a thread that led to one inescapable conclusion. Gerald Finch was not in hiding. He was not living in fear. He was dead. Someone had taken his place, not to vanish into obscurity, but to walk in Gerald Finch's shoes, just long enough to complete a carefully orchestrated deception. Miss Marple considered the facts. If Finch had truly been a threat to someone, if he had known something dangerous, then it stood to reason that his knowledge had cost him his life. Yet the man at the inn had not acted like a killer in hiding. He had not displayed the telltale signs of someone desperate to stay off the radar. Instead, he had behaved like a man playing a role, waiting for something. Waiting for what? And then it hit her. The missing piece of the puzzle that had eluded her until now. The man at the inn wasn't simply waiting in fear or hiding from his own actions. He was waiting for control. Control of Gerald Finch's name. Control of his wealth. Control of everything Finch had left behind. It was a carefully laid plan. A calculated scheme to take over Finch's life and legacy. The question now was, who stood to gain the most from it? Who would benefit from assuming Gerald Finch's identity? From manipulating his death? And from hiding the truth in the shadows? Miss Marple's mind raced as the full weight of the conspiracy began to unfold. The stakes were higher than she had initially imagined, and the danger was closer than anyone had anticipated. It was clear now they were dealing with far more than just a simple murder. They were at the center of a game of manipulation, deceit, and high-stakes power, a game where lives could be discarded without a second thought. The man at the inn had never intended to be Gerald Finch forever. His plan had been far more precise, far more cunning. He only needed to be Finch long enough to claim everything the real Gerald Finch had left behind. His wealth, his name, and his legacy. Once that was done, the imposter would disappear, vanishing into the shadows, leaving behind nothing but an empty shell of a life. Miss Marple's mind raced, connecting the dots with a speed that left her no room for doubt. The imposter's plan had been ingenious in its simplicity. He had no desire to live as Gerald Finch indefinitely. He only needed to be seen as him long enough to legally seize Finch's fortune. And once that was accomplished, he would erase every trace of Finch's existence, as though the man had never lived at all. The erasure of Finch's London residence hadn't been an act of desperation. It had been a meticulously calculated move, a way of wiping the slate clean. The real Gerald Finch had been eliminated, and in his place a double had stepped in, someone who could sign documents, settle affairs, and eventually, legally inherit everything that Finch had once possessed. But something had gone awry. Had Miss Marple's quiet interference shaken the carefully constructed plan? Or had another force been at play, one that had never been accounted for? The more Miss Marple thought about it, the more she realized that such a complex deception could rarely be carried out by just one person. Someone else had to be involved, someone who had orchestrated this entire scheme from the shadows. And now, with the false double gone, only one question remained. Who stood to gain from Gerald Finch's untimely death? As Miss Marple pondered, her hands folded serenely in her lap, her expression calm yet determined, she knew the answer would come soon enough. There were few things more revealing than a change in a man's will, especially when that man ended up dead under mysterious circumstances. The will was the key, and it was the final thread she needed to unravel this twisted web of lies. Meanwhile, Miss Marple and Elena Finch sat in the dimly lit office of Mr. Lester, the solicitor who had been entrusted with Gerald Finch's affairs. Once a model of composure, Mr. Lester's usual polished demeanor was now beginning to fray. His hands, once steady and sure, fidgeted with the papers before him. His smooth, confident voice now held an uncharacteristic hesitation, betraying his discomfort. "You must understand," he began, his words carefully chosen, but Miss Marple knew they were not the words of a man at ease. Miss Marple offered him a gentle smile, the kind of smile that disarmed yet made others nervous. "Oh, of course, Mr. Lester," she said, her tone polite, but carrying a hint of something more. No one would expect otherwise. But her words, soft as they were, carried weight. The silence between them thickened, and Miss Marple's gaze never wavered from Mr. Lester's face. She could see the tension in his eyes, the subtle flicker of guilt hidden behind a veil of professionalism. As the minutes passed, the room grew heavier with the understanding that something far more sinister was at play, and Miss Marple knew that the truth, however dark and twisted, was just within reach. But first, she had to pull at the threads, piece together the lies, and confront the one person who held the key to this entire tangled mystery. Only then would she uncover the full extent of the deception, and the dangerous game that had been played with Gerald Finch's life. Mr. Lester's expression was one of careful deliberation as he adjusted his spectacles, his hands slightly trembling. The silence between them grew, and Miss Marple's keen gaze never faltered. She waited, knowing the truth was inches away. Finally, Mr. Lester sighed, his breath heavy with the weight of the words he was about to say. "It is true," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Gerald Finch recently made amendments to his will. A rather abrupt decision, I must say." Eleanor Finch's breath caught in her throat, her eyes narrowing in anticipation. She leaned forward, her voice barely controlled, as she asked, "Who did he name as the new beneficiary?"
Mr.
Lester cleared his throat nervously. "The name was left unspecified," he replied, his voice thick with the unease he could no longer mask. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with an unsettling sharpness, her expression unwavering. "Unspecified," she echoed. "That is to say, the final draft had not yet been completed." Mr. Lester hesitated, his lips pressing together, as though weighing the consequences of his next words. "The initial version was drawn up," he said, the words coming out slowly, as if each one were a burden. "But before the final documents could be signed and formalized, Mr. Finch," he paused again, aware of how heavy the silence had become. The words that followed felt loaded with implications. "Mr. Finch passed away." The weight of the moment hung in the air, and Miss Marple's fingers gently tapped the edge of her lap, her calm demeanor belying the storm of thoughts racing through her mind. "A delicate choice of words," she remarked, almost to herself. "A man revises his will, fails to complete it, and then conveniently disappears. How very convenient." Eleanor's voice broke through the silence, tight with emotion. "You think he was killed for it?" Miss Marple's reply came softly, but with a cold clarity that sent a shiver through the room. "I think," she said, her tone almost casual, "that whoever stood to gain from that will was in quite a hurry." The truth was beginning to reveal itself, but one question lingered, refusing to be ignored. If the impostor's sole goal had been to assume Finch's wealth, why alter the will at all? Miss Marple's mind raced. She had seen deception before, intricate webs of lies and manipulation. But this was something else entirely. This was a plan so meticulous, so finely crafted, that it couldn't possibly have been the work of a single individual. The impostor may have played the role of Gerald Finch, but he was not the mastermind. No, the true orchestrator of this deception lurked somewhere in the shadows, pulling every string, manipulating every move. Gerald Finch's death had not been a coincidence. His identity had not been stolen by accident. This was a well-laid plan, one that had been set in motion long before Finch's untimely demise. And now someone was desperately trying to claim his fortune before the lies unraveled completely. Miss Marple, ever the observer, sat quietly, her gloves now smoothed in her lap. Her expression remained serene, but her mind was sharp as a blade. It was time, she decided. Time for a little cleverness. She would set a trap, but this time she wouldn't be watching the impostor. No, this time, She would be watching the one who had been watching all along, the true puppeteer behind the veil of deception. And as the final pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, Miss Marple knew that the endgame had arrived. The trap had been set, and this time, the one who had been hiding in the shadows would be forced to reveal themselves, and the truth would be exposed in all its darkness. Miss Marple knew that the most effective way to catch a guilty party wasn't to chase after them, but rather to let them come to you. And so, with a quiet and meticulous precision, she set her trap. It was a slow game, a series of well-placed moves that would lead her prey straight into the open. A casual comment to Mrs. Bantry over afternoon tea, a seemingly innocent question at the post office about sending legal documents to London, and a seemingly random conversation with the vicar about the importance of safeguarding parish records. Each conversation, carefully crafted, dropped a hint, deliberate but subtle. The village's well-known gossip channels would soon carry the message far and wide. Gerald Finch's missing will had been found. Miss Marple made sure this whispering trail reached the right ears, and with it, the air of uncertainty and panic began to build. The one who had gone to such great lengths to erase Finch's existence, to manipulate his affairs, would certainly panic upon hearing the news of the missing will. The last part of the scheme, the imposter, was already unraveling. Miss Marple wasn't interested in chasing down the imposter. That part was already in motion. What she needed was the true mastermind behind the deception, the person who had orchestrated Finch's disappearance from the start. She was certain that this individual wouldn't remain passive for long. They would act, and when they did, Miss Marple would be waiting for them. That evening, the vicarage was unusually still, an eerie silence that stretched out into the night. Even the softest sound seemed out of place in the quiet. A single lamp flickered dimly in the study, casting long, twisted shadows over the worn wooden desk. Miss Marple sat by the fireplace, her knitting resting still in her lap. Her hands were motionless, a quiet reflection of the stillness around her. Across from her, the village constable checked his watch for the umpteenth time, suppressing a yawn. "Are you certain someone will come, Miss Marple?" he whispered, breaking the stillness with his hesitant tone. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned her gaze toward the small wooden cabinet, where, supposedly, the vicar had locked away Finch's will. Her eyes lingered there for a moment, as if seeing the truth in her mind before she spoke. "Patience, constable," she murmured, her voice calm but with a knowing edge. "The moment will come." And indeed it did. The air shifted, the faintest rustle of movement barely perceptible outside the window. A soft creak of floorboards, the smallest whisper of a shadow slipping through the doorway, barely disturbing the quiet. The figure moved quickly, purposefully toward the desk. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. She remained still, her calm exterior belying the sharp focus behind her gaze. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The trap had been set, and now the true architect of Gerald Finch's demise was about to reveal themselves, one misstep at a time. The room was heavy with stillness, as the figure cloaked in darkness knelt before the cabinet. Their hands, trembling with urgency, fumbled with the lock, the metal clicking under their desperate touch. There was no grace in their movements, only a frantic search for something vital, something that would change everything. The intruder's breath came in shallow, erratic gasps, a stark contrast to the silence of the room. They sifted through the papers with gloved hands, their fingers moving rapidly, pulling documents aside, scanning them with a growing sense of panic. Then, as if their search had reached a breaking point, the figure froze. A voice, calm and controlled, broke the tension. "Looking for something." The words hung in the air, as still as the night. The intruder whipped around, eyes wide with shock, the panic unmistakable in their gaze. But by then, it was too late. The constable had moved with quiet efficiency, positioning himself in the doorway, blocking the only possible escape route. The trap had been sprung. Miss Marple, seated in the shadows, observed with her usual unruffled demeanor. Her sharp eyes never wavered, as she studied the intruder, waiting for them to make their next move. The silence that followed her simple question stretched unbearably long. The intruder stood frozen, their gloved hands hovering just above the drawer they had disturbed in their search. The stillness was broken with a sudden violent movement. The figure lunged toward the door, intent on fleeing, but the constable was already there, stepping forward with quiet resolve to block their escape. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he said, his voice low but firm. The intruder hesitated, a flicker of doubt in their eyes as they calculated their next move. Finally, with no other choice, they took a step back, their shoulders slumping in defeat. The room seemed to hold its breath, as the weight of the situation settled in. The inevitability of their capture was palpable. With deliberate composure, Miss Marple reached for the lamp on the desk, raising it to shed more light on the scene. The room brightened, casting harsh shadows, and illuminating the guilty party in full view. It was Mr. Lester, the solicitor. His usual composed demeanor was shattered. His face had drained of color, and a bead of sweat formed on his temple as his eyes darted between Miss Marple, the constable, and the open drawer that had been his undoing. The truth, like a tightening noose, was closing in around him. "Well now," Miss Marple said, her tone as serene as ever, "I do believe we finally have the full measure of things, don't we, Mr. Lester?" His face twisted in disbelief. This is absurd," he stammered, trying desperately to maintain his composure. "I don't know what you—" Miss Marple's gaze remained steady, her patience unshaken. She tilted her head slightly, studying him with the quiet intensity of someone who had already unraveled every thread of deceit. "I think," she said, her voice almost gentle, "that you weren't expecting anyone to be waiting for you." Lester's throat tightened as he swallowed hard. His eyes flickered toward the open drawer, the contents now a damning testament to his guilt. His escape plan had crumbled, and the truth was right there in front of him. Undeniable, inescapable. The will, the one that had been hidden so carefully, lay at the center of everything. Miss Marple's voice, soft and almost gentle, cut through the tension as she addressed Mr. Lester. "You weren't looking for just any document, were you?" she asked, her gaze unwavering. "You were searching for the will, the one you so desperately tried to keep buried." Lester's lips tightened into a thin, bloodless line, his usual composed exterior cracking under the weight of her words. Her next sentence was a quiet affirmation, as though she were simply stating a fact that had already been established. "Of course you already knew that Gerald Finch was dead." With those words, the last shred of Lester's composure evaporated. His breath came out in a mixture of a weary sigh and a bitter laugh, and for a moment it seemed as though the full realization of his situation hit him all at once. "You think you know everything, don't you?" Lester muttered, his voice laced with frustration. Miss Marple, in her typical modest manner, merely smiled in response. "Not everything, dear," she replied, her voice soft but sharp with quiet understanding. "Only enough." Lester sank into the chair behind him, the fight draining from his body. The weight of the truth had finally crushed him, and he slumped, defeated. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he said at last, his voice tinged with regret. "The plan was perfect." "Oh, I'm sure it was," Miss Marple replied, her tone almost kind, but tinged with the knowledge that perfection had been elusive. Gerald Finch's fortune, waiting to be claimed once his identity had been carefully erased and replaced. "And of course you had help." Lester exhaled deeply, rubbing his temples as if trying to banish the memory of it all. "The imposter couldn't have managed it alone," he muttered, his voice growing more resigned. "He was supposed to be out of the way, a quiet, neat affair. But Finch changed everything. He rewrote the will, and suddenly, it wasn't so simple anymore." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving him. "So you acted," she said, a statement rather than a question. Lester's silence was enough of an answer. The constable, standing nearby, stepped forward and placed a firm hand on Lester's shoulder. "It's over, Mr. Lester," he said, his voice final. The deception had been intricate, a web carefully spun to conceal the truth. The scheme had been well planned, each step calculated to ensure the will's disappearance went unnoticed. But in the end, the truth had surfaced, as it always did. Justice was now within reach, and Miss Marple, as ever, had simply been there, watching, waiting for the inevitable to unfold. As the final chapter of the mystery drew near, Miss Marple sat at the vicarage with the constable, Elena Finch, and a rather pale-looking Mr. Lester. The time had come to lay out the final truth, to reveal the last pieces of the puzzle. She regarded them all in turn, her mind tracing the twists and turns that had led them here. "It is," she began, her voice steady, "I suppose time to explain how the pieces fit together." "Rather clever, but not without its flaws," Miss Marple began, her tone mild, yet carrying the weight of her sharp observation. The constable gave a brief nod, clearly satisfied with the conclusion. "We have all the evidence we need, Miss Marple, but I would still like to hear how you pieced it together." Miss Marple's lips curled into a small smile, as she settled deeper into her chair, her fingers gently resting on her lap. "It was the matter of identity that troubled me from the start," she explained thoughtfully. "Gerald Finch, as the villagers recalled, had always been a man of routine, predictable, punctual, almost rigid in his habits. Yet the man who arrived at the inn was nothing like that. He was nervous, too watchful, as though he were playing a part, too aware of the eyes that followed him." As she spoke, her knitting needles clicked in rhythmic precision, the sound sharp in the quiet room. And then, of course, there was the matter of the obituary, the funeral, the closed casket, everything arranged so neatly. It was all too convenient, don't you think? No one could verify the truth, and no one would dare question it. Her voice softened as she turned toward Elena. "And once I saw the photograph," Miss Marple continued, her words carefully chosen, "I knew." Elena's voice barely rose above a whisper, a soft breath of realization. "Knew what?" she asked, the tension palpable. Miss Marple folded her hands gently in her lap. "I knew the man at the inn wasn't Gerald Finch at all. He was Richard Finch, Gerald's half-brother, a man believed to be dead for years." A murmur rippled through the room. "Richard Finch," the constable repeated, astonished. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her gaze sharp. "Yes," Richard Finch returned, "killed his brother, and with Mr. Lester's assistance, stepped into Gerald's life. He assumed Gerald's name, his affairs, his wealth. It was all so meticulously planned, so very neat." Her gaze settled on the solicitor, who shifted uneasily under the weight of her scrutiny. "Wasn't it Mr. Lester?" Miss Marple's voice was calm, almost pitying. Lester swallowed hard, his throat tight, but he said nothing, his silence betraying his guilt. Miss Marple's voice remained steady, though her words grew sharper. "The real Gerald Finch never left London. He was murdered there, his body discreetly disposed of, then falsely identified in a closed casket funeral. After all, who would dare question it when the solicitor's word carried so much weight? Mr. Lester ensured all the paperwork was in order." Lester's breath slowed, a deep, defeated exhale escaping his lips. "You make it sound so simple," he muttered, his voice heavy with regret. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her gaze unwavering. "The best plans often are," she replied softly. "But of course things didn't remain so tidy, did they, Mr. Finch?" She leaned forward slightly, her expression unreadable. "Your imposter was nearly in the clear, but then he panicked. He altered the plan, made a mistake, and that's where everything began to unravel." The silence that followed was thick with anticipation, the weight of her words hanging in the air like a storm on the verge of breaking. The will, that was the moment Richard Finch had sealed his fate. A plan carefully constructed, yet it hinged on one fatal flaw, the assumption that no one would look too closely. Elena's eyes darkened as she spoke, her voice low with realization. "He wanted to make sure I got nothing," she murmured. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze unwavering. "A hastily rewritten will," she said, her voice soft but precise. "One designed to ensure that Richard Finch could claim the entire Finch fortune, that he could replace his dead brother, and live his life as Gerald. She turned her attention to Lester, her sharp eyes not missing a thing. And of course you, Mr. Lester, took care of the rest, ensuring the legal formalities were perfectly arranged. Lester exhaled sharply, his composure crumbling as the weight of his actions caught up with him. We didn't expect anyone to question it, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper, the confidence he once carried now shattered. Miss Marple smiled kindly, but there was no warmth in it. No, dear, you didn't expect me, she replied, her voice full of quiet authority. A thick silence settled over the room, the tension so palpable that it seemed to hold its breath. The case had closed. The deception painstakingly crafted was unraveled, piece by piece. The guest who had arrived a week after his own death had never been Gerald Finch. He was Richard Finch, a man with a past, now unmasked. And now, justice was about to run its course. The constable wasted no time in placing Richard under arrest, his voice grave as he recited the charges of murder and identity fraud. The words hung in the air like an inevitable storm. You don't understand, Richard muttered in a low voice, his face twisted in despair. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Miss Marple, ever composed, tilted her head slightly. No, dear, it never is, she replied softly, the words both a reassurance and a warning. Meanwhile, Lester fared no better. His frantic attempt to erase the will only solidified his involvement. The very document he had desperately tried to suppress now stood as irrefutable proof of his guilt, of forgery, conspiracy, and even complicity in murder. The constable, his face grim, read off the list of charges with finality. You'll both hang for this. And so, with chilling precision, the case was closed, the village of St. Mary Me exhaling a collective sigh of relief. But the resolution came with a lingering sense of unease. The man who had arrived after his own death had been exposed. But what of the bigger picture? St. Mary Me returned to its peaceful, uneventful existence, at least for now. As Miss Marple sat by her window that evening, cradling a delicate teacup, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. Justice had been served, but the thoughts in her mind ran deeper, further than the case she had just solved. She gazed out toward the distant churchyard, her gaze resting on the unassuming headstone that bore Gerald Finch's name. A life erased, a man replaced, a name stolen as easily as one might change a coat. How long had Richard Finch waited for this opportunity? Had he planned this for years, biding his time, or had fate simply handed him an unexpected chance? More chilling still, Miss Marple wondered how many others had disappeared in such a way, how many lives had been rewritten, faces replaced, identities stolen without a trace. She let the thought linger, as if allowing the shadows to stretch long in her mind, before she set her cup down with a quiet smile. After all, mysteries such as these were best left for another day, another puzzle, another time. For now St. Mary Me was at peace once more, its mysteries tucked away, waiting for the next unraveling.